Right, hi. I just thought it'd be worthwhile, since we're talking about state power and state intrusion, just to kind of reflect on events in America in the last couple of days where the entire armed forces of the FBI couldn't spot a nerd with a rifle climbing across the roof. And so it does suggest that maybe the state isn't as all-powerful as we might think. I don't know if you remember that old maxim, military intelligence is a contradiction in terms. It might still hold true today. So even though democratic institutions, as we know, as a result of that, are clearly under threat these days, and I don't want to minimize concerns about that, but I want to put them in perspective a little bit. So hopefully, you can take it or leave it as what I've got to say. One thing we have to thank Richard Tice for, maybe many things, I don't know, but one of them from Reform UK is that he overturned a 25,000-seat majority of Matt Warman MP, who is the Minister for Digital Innovation. And his idea of innovation, by the way, is increasing online security. That's his big idea. And while they kind of sell it on the basis that online security is about stopping terrorists from plotting online or child porn or whatever it might be, that's the way it kind of is sold to us. But in reality, the Online Safety Act, which was the result of all this conversation, threatens personal liberty, personal privacy, with an end-to-end encryption messaging. That's what they were planning on doing. So they can actually read any message that you put out there if they ask for it. So obviously they can't charge you with threatening behavior or problematic communication if they can't read your messages. So they now made it much easier for them to do that. So I lived in China for quite some time. And I think, as some people were saying, we kind of grew up knowing the difference between China and the West. China is authoritarian, we have free speech and tolerance, and they're a one-party state, and we have this wonderful democracy. So we weren't really convinced, I'm sure, when Chinese companies like Huawei, the phone company, when they said, don't worry, even if you give us entry into your telecommunication system, we won't hand over the data to the Chinese state, because we know that if the Chinese state asks for it, let me tell you, they're going to give it. But when you then look at Facebook in the West, or Meta under Nick Clegg, they actually handed over personal data to the American government, to the American police, to the British establishment, and they also had a non-disclosure act imposed upon them, so they can't actually talk about it. So it's probably even worse. But it's straight out of the Chinese playbook, you would have thought, except for the fact that China does it under duress. Chinese companies are forced to hand over information, whereas Facebook gave it voluntarily. Facebook closed down Donald Trump's Facebook page of their own volition. So I think we have to be a little bit kind of cautious about seeing authoritarians everywhere, because, well, they are, but it's in a different guise to maybe what we recognize. I don't know if you remember Neil Ferguson, good old Professor Neil Ferguson. He was very excited when he realized that we could lock down people like China did. But again, it's worth reminding that in China, the authoritarian one-party state, they responded to public protests in order to stop lockdown. So while we in all the democracies in the West were waiting to be told that we could go outside and lockdown was over, we were waiting to be informed that we could claim back our lives, China, people went on the street and forced the authorities to back down and forced the end of lockdown. So sometimes things aren't as black and white as we see them, and I want to look at maybe the reality of state monitoring, maybe through part of the prism of China. When I was driving with a friend of mine in a place called Suzhou, which is just outside Shanghai, he ran through a red light. And he must have been like within a split second, there was this ping on his phone, and they charged him the fine straight away through his bank account. And it's like, remarkable and wonderful and fascinating and appalling and atrocious at the same time. That's what technology is like. But during that lockdown, China really went to town on digitization, and everything now, if you go to China, is paid for by apps, mainly in the big cities. You can't get a taxi, you can't really buy a coffee or a beer or whatever without a mobile banking app. And so effectively China became a cashless society. Yeah. But actually what then happened after lockdown is that old people started complaining because they didn't have maybe mobile phones, so they didn't have access to it. Hotels that wanted to try to encourage tourists back into China started complaining. And actually that level of protest, that level of concern, made the authorities back down somewhat and have opened up some of those kind of banking systems and have put cash back in the system. So, sometimes political pressure works, is what I'm trying to say. And when I was in China just a couple of weeks ago in Shanghai, I had to register with a payment act. Forgive me, I had to get one. It took me about an hour to fill in the nonsense that they ask you for, all the information that they want. And the final page was this facial recognition camera app. And I held it in front of my face, and in Chinese it was saying, "Stop covering your mouth. Stop covering your chin." So this kind of major Chinese state authoritarian regime can't deal with a beard. So maybe we have less to worry about than we suspect. In terms of there's a new book out actually, which is called Sentinel State by Min Pei. It looks at how China actually controls such a huge country, which is no mean feat in its own terms. And he says that while there are kind of tough penalties, and we all know that they lock a lot of people up, there's also a trend for what he calls preventative repression. That's quite sexy, isn't it? Preventative repression. It's a bit like that Tom Cruise movie 20 years ago, Minority Report, pre-crime and all that. So it's basically the idea that that China operates through a massive police state network. He says actually that's quite small, and what it relies on is low-tech, labor-intensive approaches. Low-tech, labor-intensive. That's the classic image maybe of Chinese apparatchik informants. Who are going to give information to the state when they see other people behaving badly. So I remind you of Mark Warman. Remember him? He's no longer an MP, but he was, at the time he got kicked out, was introducing something called vouching, where, quotes, suspicious individuals can be identified through trusted people within the community. Who are those trusted people? Well, the government says that they are dentists, doctors, accountants, amongst others. No wonder people are pulling their own teeth out. Well, you can apply. You can certainly apply. So all those people that you're supposed to trust are actually mandated to report on you through the system and become part of that kind of state machinery. Not that they do. Don't want to frighten you too much, but it's there to be done if need be. And that kind of monitoring that in China and in the UK in different ways increases a suspicion of each other, which I think is really unhealthy, leads to greater social fragmentation rather than unification. So when we come to slightly less authoritarian measures, soft power, which obviously China is trying to do a lot, President Xi Jinping went to the Science Fiction Writers Guild a while ago, and he told them that science fiction, quotes, is a good vehicle for conveying the country's strength in science and technology. So go forth and write. Whereas, Western science fiction is thought to be miserable, dystopian, we're all going to die, we're all going to drown, the future is terrible. President Xi assumed that Chinese writers would be more positive about Chinese century. Actually, it hasn't worked out that way, because actually Chinese people are as miserable as us. But in the West, when you think about it, telling Western writers what to write by a politician goes against the whole ethos of what we expect of free expression. Over here, instead, we have what's called sensitivity readers. I don't know if you've come across those, yes? These are people who look for anything in a book that might cause offense. And I was reading recently Anthony Horowitz, the children's author, very, very good author, was asked to take out the word scalpel from one of his books, scalpel. And that was because Native American readers might take offense. I'd work that one out for yourself. It's something to do with being scalped. Anyway, and also in an Essex library, they had to remove a children's book called The Three Monsters because one person complained that one of the monsters had said, "We don't want any funny foreigner types around here." So, and that book has been banned. So restrictions take many, many, many forms. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of liberal conversations that happen in China. Probably I've had more open, frank conversations in China with ordinary people than I have necessarily in this country. The basic point, I think, if I can round up, is that we kind of need a bit more nuance, if that's possible, a bit less paranoia. Technology is a tool, it's a very useful tool, it can help us connect, and we're right to be wary of it, but at the same time, we mustn't be conspiratorial. Technology can be used for good, I'm sure we all know this, but it can, it can deny us access to money, but it can also set up possibilities for political mobilization and for political conversations. Certainly, millions of Chinese people are finding this out, right? They don't necessarily have the same freedoms of access and organization as we do, but they're using social media to find that out. Even if that ends up in them getting a low social credit score and refusing them the right to travel, they're finding many more creative ways to engage in political criticism because they think it's important. They think it's genuinely important. They think kind of democratic conversations are important. Hard to believe, but it's out there. Actually, wherever we are, when people come together with critical opinions, it's the social and political rights. That's where they won. In the engagement between people, the technology is almost secondary, or maybe a technology that can advance that, can help that, or can hold us back. But that's for us to decide, not for the technologists. Thank you very much. It's like, China's funny, isn't it? I mean, it's basically, China says it's a democracy. Yeah. In the same way, when the Brexit election was happening, I remember that China allied itself with the European Union in as much as they were saying, look, the European Union is a centralized authority, it makes certain rules, but then it passes it down the chain, right? And like, if you're in Leeds, you can make it work, right? They'll give you the mandate, but they'll give you the freedom to try and maybe work it out for yourself. And that's what we do in China, they say. Do you know what I mean? We're a centralized central party system. We come up with all the rules, we pass it down the chain, and if you're living in Xinjiang province or somewhere, you have to make it happen. So on that level, they say, what's there not to like, right? We're a democracy in the same way European Union are. They weren't very favorable to Brexit, as it happens, because that was a bit too much of an expression of self-interest. But when it does come to, see, the thing about China, I mean, I don't know why I'm really talking about China, but anyway, when it comes to China, one of the key things they want to try and do is to maintain the party, yes? So bugger the everything else. It's about maintaining the party. So they talk about a harmonious society. It's all about how do you maintain the rule of the party, which actually will then maintain the next role of accumulation, or whatever the next role of industrialization. So whatever threatens the role of the party, therefore becomes a threat. So one of the classic examples was about, 10 years ago or something, where the Marxist Party in Beijing University started having meetings and started organizing people and having these out of university rallies. And that was too much independence for the Communist Party. So they shut them down and disbanded them. So the Marxist Party was basically ruled out of order by the Marxist Party, because so what's happening in China is, in terms of its development, is that it kind of lets out the real for creativity and self-expression, because it needs that. It needs those kind of independent entrepreneurs to actually develop interesting business ideas, Alibaba and all these Tencent and all these kind of organizations, to try to bring some dynamism into Chinese economic life. But obviously, once they become too independent, once they become too, up their own backside, once they start criticizing the state for not giving them enough freedom to take money, then they start getting clamped down. And you see that with a lot of people. I mean, Jack Ma from Alibaba was actually locked up, disappeared. Well, let's just say he disappeared for like 8 months and reprogrammed, so he didn't do it again. So there's a freedom in China until you go too far. Yes. Now, whether you could say that about this country, I don't really know, because it's not exactly the same. So we are literally on other sides of the world. We're literally poles apart, and we see democracy and the way we organize society completely differently. So I think that it's a very difficult one to compare and contrast. All I'm trying to say is that actually, when we slag off China for being authoritarian, very often the people saying it miss the fact that it's much closer to home that we should be worried about.
Okay.
I'm going to look at the conspiracy point as well, because I quite liked the conspiracy people that were out and being slagged off as being conspiratorial. Because for me, especially during COVID itself, it was very much an example of people trying to work out what the hell was going on. rather than just being sold a line. And in some ways, it became conspiratorial because many people couldn't actually believe what really was happening. And they were hoping that it was something more conspiratorial than the truth of the fact that things were out of control. So I thought mainly most conspiratorial people were actually quite sensible thinkers, which was not the way it's been portrayed. But as somebody said, that there is this conversation, like instead of saying left-wing people or right-wing people, we now say far left and far right. And there's a new book out called Centrism, which is this kind of new mandate from the powers that be, who are actually trying to marginalize opinion with which they disagree and kind of put it out into the margins and say that actually only central consensual discussion is going to be legitimate and approved of. And you know where that is. I mean, apart from the fact it's Lib Dems with more MPs, it's also the fact that it's going to be a very mainstream established position that we're going to have to concur with, which I find really problematic. The second thing is on terms of laws, in my opinion, since I mentioned Brexit and European Union, I broke the barrier and said it, is that since that time, where the British government was always relying on blaming the European Union for the problems, and then when Brexit happened, it had to look to itself to actually be part of the solution and didn't have any clues. In some ways, the courts have now taken on that role. And you can now see kind of laws and courts and judges who are seen to be this kind of arbiter of impartiality. And the politicians are saying, don't blame me. The courts have decided. It's the law. And so you now have this welter of legislation from nowhere. You turn on the TV for the Lords or the Commons, you can see thousands of pieces of legislation going through where none really is necessary, or where existing laws would do the trick, like stopping XR protesters from in the street. There's plenty of laws to stop that happening, or people sitting in front of cars and stopping the traffic. There's many, many laws doing that, but they want to have an industry of legislation behind which they can fall to say it's not us, there's a legislative process, it's impartial, and if you disagree with that, then you are in some ways some anarcho-syndicalist who's actually trying to overthrow the system, because that's where real stability lies. Let me just quickly say one final point, if you don't mind, in terms of this debanking thing, since I've obviously avoided it. But I did read, and this may go against the grain of everything that's held dear in this room, but I read the Financial Conduct Authority report, which said, let me get to the end of the sentence before you boo me. It said, ideologically motivated account closures are vanishingly rare. Not a single account was closed because of customers' political views in 2021-22. What they're actually saying is, and it's not a proud boast, they're saying that if they have reason to believe that there's financial misconduct, for example, then the cost of doing the inquiry and finding that out is so extortionate that they'd rather close your account and not bother. And that's the tendency of what they're doing. Thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people are having their bank accounts. I think it was 350,000 people last year had their accounts closed down because they couldn't be asked to check it out. In terms of is it a cock-up or conspiracy, I think it's just simply bureaucracy. I work in a university, I think you do as well, David, and it's there's 67% of the people who work in universities are admin staff, and the faculty are an afterthought. Very difficult to kind of, once you're in it, to tackle it, to challenge it, rather than maybe stand outside it. And for me, that's probably the most important thing to do in events like this. If I had this conversation in a university, nobody would have come because it would have been cancelled, and B, it would have been maybe preaching to one or two converted, whereas I think this is a much more open, frank conversation forum. So I think that's one thing. In the same way as, like I was trying to say before, that governments or authorities on every level in civic forums are reliant on NGOs now, rather than themselves taking decisions. They're looking to Stonewalls or critical race activists or wherever it might be, third-party agencies, to really kind of be the ones that they can outsource responsibility to, so they don't have to take the blame themselves. So that's a real problem, I think, structurally in society. Very quickly, if I can, on the net zero point. Obviously, the part about net zero is not necessarily the thing itself. It's the idea that humans are a problem. You know, if nature comes first, humans come a very poor second. So it's a very Malthusian agenda that we eat too much, we travel too much, we do too much, we breathe too much. So I think that there's a couple of things which I think you could focus on. One is the arguments, really trying to point out to those people who are into the environment, really, if they follow their own logic, should be celebrating austerity, which is around the corner, because we won't be able to travel so much, so therefore surely they should be joyous. I won't be, but I think that's one thing we can really stick it to them on. Second one is the heat pump thing, which is coming back with a vengeance. This extortionate nonsense of heating your home with a heat pump and having to redo all of your radiators and pipework for £20,000 to save 150 a year. Third one, is the developing world, which I think, pointing to the developing world and the lack of development and the fact that if net zero really kicks in, these people are going to stay underdeveloped for the rest of their days. And I mean, when you look today and see the poverty that exists, not just in this country, which is bad enough, but the squalor that exists in the third world in this day and age is unbearable. And I think that the idea that... Thanks. I'll give you money later. It's more the fact that there's a movement, an environmental movement, which suggests that you should maybe pay people not to develop so that they actually don't despoil the natural world. So I think that's always a good one to use. And the final one is one I saw online earlier today, which is that there were about 4 protesters who stood outside Greenpeace's headquarters and poured coal all over their front entrance. So, maybe we can use some of the tactics against them that they've been using us for a long time. Thanks.